watching Evo TV. We're a new show dedicated to ecology, sustainability, and community organizing. Today we will look at the growing energy demands and how these are starting to impact British Columbian lives as well as our environment. Seemingly unrelated events and issues start to enter BC's landscape, from privatization of waterways, the announced Site C, to the Enbridge pipeline. And out of these emerges a pattern. Today we will look at what lies at the heart of these issues and projects that would forever alter British Columbian landscapes. We are joined by Christianne Wihelmson, Executive Director of Georgia Strait Alliance, with a Master's of Science in Ecology. Also with us is Ben West, a communities campaigner and organizer of the Wilderness Committee, and Rex Weyler, co-founder of Greenpeace International, ecologist, author, and journalist. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
These seemingly random patterns are actually starting to emerge as tied to one particular topic, that of energy demands and that of Kinder Morgan, which is the issue that we'll discuss today. I'm wondering if you can describe a little bit about what Kinder Morgan is currently doing as a corporation and what its projects are for British Columbia.
Well, what we're seeing right now is an increase in the amount of tar sands oil that's coming through the Westridge terminal in Burnaby. And the result is an increase in oil tanker traffic through the Strait of Georgia and out through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This has actually been an ongoing pattern that really has only, gained the attention of community groups recently because all the decisions have been made behind closed doors. So Kinder Morgan in 2005 and 2006 made requests to increase the amount of tar sands fuel they were pumping down through Westridge. And just recently, this spring, they put in another application which will result in more tankers. In 2010, there were 71 oil tankers that went through the Strait. So that's 140 passes. By 2016, we expect that to be close to 300. So they're doing it through all the formal channels, but communities are not being involved in the conversation. And it's just industry that's deciding that we as communities are going to take the risk for having more tar sands fuel coming through our waters.
The reason for this is, of course, the energy demands that are found elsewhere, because from my understanding, BC actually has enough energy in terms of electricity. I can't necessarily say for oil, but there is a growing demand for both oil and electricity elsewhere. And most of these projects are tied to either US or internationally, such as Chinese market, which is a growing market, a hungrier market, I should say. So one of the things we have seen is that these projects seem to be continuing despite their potential ecological impact. The tanker increase in terms of traffic would potentially have devastating consequences for the local ecological systems. Can you comment, Christianne, a little bit about what the potential impact would be in case of an oil spill?
It's almost unimaginable. I mean, we're talking about crude oil here. We're talking about the type of oil that could be absolutely devastating. And depending on where it happens, I mean, if it happens under the Second Narrows Bridge, I mean, you're talking about Burrard Inlet and soon the entire strait having crude oil all through it. If it happens around the Gulf Islands, it depends on what time of year it happens. I mean, there is no good scenario. And the biggest concern here is that the industry is telling us that everything's safe. But I'll tell you this, British Columbians are not believing them because the reality is when industry says they've done a great job at cleaning up an oil spill, that means they've recovered between 15 and 25% of the oil. That means our oceans have to absorb the 75% of the crude oil. So there's an attitude around risk that the industry seems very comfortable taking, but we as communities are not. So, I mean, just imagine, people who live in this region love it because of the oceans. They go to the beaches, they go to the Gulf Islands, they kayak, they're out on the water. All that would be impacted negatively if we had a crude oil tanker impact. And industry has done what they call a risk assessment. But the reality is the only people around the table during that discussion was industry. And they've got a very different sense of risk than we do. They were looking at corporate risk. They didn't include the environment. They didn't include social impacts. They didn't include all the other economic impacts of a spill. So the impacts of a crude oil spill on our coast would be devastating for years to come. And you just need to look at where the Exxon Valdez spilled. The communities there have yet to recover.
What are some of the impacts of the Exxon Valdez spill after all these years? We kind of have to address that. If something like that were to occur, like how long would we be looking at cleanup costs, and what are some of the long-term consequences that British Columbia would actually have to deal with?
I mean, some of them are economic, like fisheries gone. Southern killer whales in Exxon Valdez, some of the transient populations have not recovered at all. Our southern resident killer whales are endangered. There's only 86 left right now. An oil spill, if it happened to be when they're around, would destroy that population. But there's also social impacts. In the communities around where the Exxon Valdez happened, they have not recovered. People have lost their jobs, broken up families. People have their suicide rates have gone up because people have had their entire lives destroyed. So those conversations aren't happening when we're talking about this. There just seems to be this attitude that it brings economic benefit to a few groups and people, but the economic losses of a spill, which, you know, the risks are there and they're growing. The more oil you have going through waters and the more oil per tanker, because, you know, these tankers that are coming through our waters are huge. And this is another decision that's been made, is that it's not just that there's more tankers going through, they're carrying more fuel. They've increased the draft on the tankers, so they actually carry more fuel. So if you look at the communities around where the Exxon Valdez spilled, you know, it's social, it's economic, it's ecological, and it's also, and those impacts, there's no reason why they would not happen at that degree here.
It's very interesting because we are talking about touted benefits of these projects. One of the things that we are being told is that this is going to create jobs, but at the same token, we are also taking into account that a lot of people are going to lose jobs if an oil spill were to occur, and chances are it will. Can you tell us a little bit about whether or not there will be any economical benefits directly to British Columbians?
Well, I mean, there are certainly coast pilots who you know, drive the tankers out of here. There's people working at the refinery, but it's a small number of people. That fuel comes from Alberta to Burnaby, and then it leaves. Mm-hmm. There's no refinery. We're down to one refinery in the Burnaby area. There were a larger number of refineries.
There were four at one point. They've shut down 3 refineries. So we're losing local jobs.
Yeah. To
ship oil to China or California, to buy it back as refined fuel, or Australia buys it or somebody buys it. So we're the oil port for the tar sands. Mm-hmm. Sorry to interrupt,
but
I mean, you know, they shut down. We have 4 refineries here. I'm not suggesting we refine oil tar sands oil in BC. We should shut down the tar sands. It's one of the worst environmental catastrophes on the planet. But Vancouver doesn't want to be the shipping port, and the people of Vancouver don't want to be the shipping port, and we take all the risk. And you say, like, what is this for? Is this for oil demand? I say, well, it's for money. These oil companies are going to make a tremendous amount of money. They want to bring these Suez Max tankers. These are the largest tankers that can go through the Suez Canal. They want to bring them into Burrard Inlet, which means they have to dredge under the Second Narrows Bridge. I don't think this is going to go over well with the First Nations or the communities of BC. We don't want to dredge the Second Narrows so we can bring Suez-sized million-barrel tankers in here to load up tar sands oil in our port to sell anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. And there is demand for energy. Canada has plenty of demand for energy. We could take every drop of energy that we can get out of Canada, we could use here, because we do import oil into Canada. So we're exporting our resource and then importing gasoline products.
One of the also aspects of higher density is that that's really the prevalent option for a lot of people. A lot of people don't necessarily have accessible green spaces to begin with, mm-hmm. especially in a city that has as high density as Metro Vancouver, for example. Mm-hmm. But going back to the issue of oil in Kinder Morgan, can we compare potential disasters to that of the recent BP oil spill?
Well, for example, yeah, because you were asking earlier, if there was a spill in this region, what would it cost us? Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, all you have to do is look at the Gulf of Mexico and what happened down there. And the same thing would happen here. Who started cleaning up first? The local citizens, the local Coast Guard, people on boats. You know, the citizens were essentially left to defend their shoreline. And sure, eventually some government boats came in and BP got boats down there and they started sucking the stuff up and so forth. In the end, it cost that region over $40 billion. Some are saying the number's up to $50 or $60 billion. Florida alone claims that their tourism industry, their fishing industry, and convention industries and so forth lost $20 billion. This is Florida alone. So what would it cost our region? We've done the study. We've looked at businesses that rely on the water, everything from whale watching. The conventions that come into Vancouver aren't going to come in if our bay. And remember, the tide goes in and out every day, twice a day, every day all year. We don't get to decide how the tide works. It works on its own. And it would wash an oil spill anywhere between Juan de Fuca Strait and Burrard Inlet. It would wash an oil spill all the way up to Courtenay and beyond. And out into Victoria and so forth. It would cost our region $30 or $40 billion at least with a major oil spill in this region. And so we are taking this massive risk, not only to our marine environment, but to our coastal economy and every person that lives in British Columbia. We're taking this massive $40 billion risk. Kinder Morgan doesn't even have $40 billion worth of assets. Mm-hmm. So how would they pay for it? So who will pay for it? We will.
Mm-hmm. I found a couple of interesting stats. It says that Exxon Valdez ran in 1989, and it spilled 41 million liters of oil. That's a hell of a lot of cleanup to do. And it spread 2,000 kilometers worth of coastline. And it devastated the population of so much wildlife that we, quite frankly, economically depend on. A lot of our economy is aimed at ecotourism and the fact that we have this beautiful wilderness and a lot of interesting species, and people come and study them or watch them or just be near them.
So keep in mind that the Exxon Valdez is often used as an example, and it's a devastating example, but keep in mind it's number 30 on the list of large oil spills. Mm-hmm. Exxon Valdez is I think it's down to 32 now or something. Mm-hmm. There's way huger oil spills all over the world, in Korea, in Singapore, in Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico, etc. Mm-hmm. And every port that becomes an oil port has oil spills, 100%. You want to be an oil port? Here's the cost. You have oil spills. The other thing to remember is that there is more oil spilled into the ocean every day in what they call normal procedure, normal spillage, normal operational spillage than from large-scale oil spills. So if you become an oil port, oil's leaking into your region at a faster rate than massive oil spills, and eventually you will have a massive oil spill.
Yeah. Even Burrard Inlet recently said that they've conducted a study and they've tested the water and they realized that there are a lot of these minor little drips of oil.
And that's no surprise. The fact that they had to do a study, I mean, we've known about that for years. The Chevron refinery is leaching fossil fuels into the water every day. It is a contaminated site to beat all contaminated sites, yet it is allowed to continue. There's this attitude amongst our government. I mean, there's permitted pollution, never mind fossil fuel going around Burrard Inlet, but around coastal North America, every year, a small oil spill are 15 times the volume of the Exxon Valdez. Every year. This isn't major catastrophic spills. So this idea that we're only talking about the major spills is something also we need to dissuade. I mean, this is the little spills coming off small ships, big ships, around the refineries, around the ports, the pipelines themselves going through British Columbia. There are spills all the time. So, you know, it's always a bit frustrating that this attitude of you know, everything's fine. We now have double-hulled tankers. Everything's okay. Well, that's not a solution. And again, it's interesting that industry's talking about everything's fine. We've got the highest standards, double-hulled. It's all good. But when you poll British Columbians, the majority of British Columbians think there's a likelihood of an oil spill in the Burrard Inlet, Georgia Strait area. And this is April 2011 polling. And the majority also don't believe we're ready. And they're right. We're not ready.
And they're right.
Because we don't have enough funding put into our emergency response system. They're only now talking to the company that's responsible for oil spills that used to be called Burrard Clean. Mm. And they're only now asking them, can you guys look at the issue of whether you're ready for crude tanker?
Mm. I've seen these guys out on the beach out at Kate's Park with their little chains, and they're all out there, and they've got a couple of pickups parked there, and they've got this little floaters, and they're sort of like dragging it across the beach. And I'm thinking, oh my God! And we're gonna have an oil spill at Burrard Inlet, and we're gonna call these guys with their 2 pickup trucks.
Burrard, I'm not. I don't want to be critical of the company because the reality is the oil spill industry is aiming low. Like even if you say like they're doing their best, let's But the reality is, when we have a spill, most of it stays on our beaches, most of it goes in our water. even if these guys had even if we had all the equipment, like, you know, all the equipment possible and all the skills, and if we gave them all the money, we still have a massive problem.
I didn't mean to in any way belittle the company, because we would need these guys, but we need 100 of these companies.
Yeah, exactly.
We need 200 pickups and 200 ships and so forth.
Well, that's the interesting thing about it, right? The cleanup is always considered as part of the earnings. It's part of it's boosting the profits, right? In the province.
Well, I mean, I think one thing that's worth remembering here is that even if there was no oil spill, it's not like everything would be hunky-dory, right? I mean, the Onion News Network, who I love, you got to try to have a sense of humor in the midst of all this. You know, they actually did a piece where they said there was a huge catastrophe. A tanker actually made its way all the way to its destination and unloaded the fuel and then burned it all and went into the atmosphere, right? Like I mean, this is the reality. I mean, like, I think every time we're talking about this, we should be looking in the eyes of people living in refugee camps somewhere in the world and saying, we don't really care. You know, because ultimately that's what we're saying. If we're saying we're going to drastically expand our shipments of oil because we're going to make money off of it and that's great for us. This really isn't just about how much money we're going to make versus how much risk we're willing to take for our own beaches. As much as the oil spill potential is horrible for our own beaches and for our own coastline, I think we also need to be looking at our responsibility as global citizens in light of the fact that we know that climate change is very real. I mean, we are basically the choke point in between the tar sands in Alberta and these huge expanding markets in Asia. You know, the part of it's about the United States and California, but really the big demand is coming from China right now. And we're the gateway to the Pacific, right? Like, this is a gateway corridor initiative that we're talking about.
BP spill, interestingly enough, the company is not going to pay for all the costs associated with it. If the same thing were to happen in BC, do we have any sort of warranties?
Nothing.
No, because the reality is, like, the pipeline is Kinder Morgan, but then it goes on to a tanker, and it's another company, and it's an international company, and the only thing we know is they're all paying into the pot to have Bard Clean help with the cleanup. But going after a culprit, good luck.
These companies disappear like that. You know, these companies can be registered in Panama and Colombia, who knows. Once it's on the ship, Kinder Morgan will say it's not our responsibility. Exactly. Exxon will say it's not our responsibility. Syncrude will say it's not our oil. And the shipping company who's technically responsible disappears, registered, a numbered company registered in the Cayman Islands with the boat registered in Panama, and they're gone. They disappeared. They're bankrupt. And we're left with a $40 billion bill to clean up our bay.
Are there examples of this in BC?
Of spills?
Of just pollution in general that companies do not clean up?
I can't think of an example where they did clean up.
I was going to say, you know.
Are there any examples where they did clean up?
I mean, municipalities, you know, there's just an accident Friday with dumping raw sewage into Burd Inlet. You know, pollution of Burd Inlet is happening all the time. And trying to get back to a company to spill it. Well, you know, because even every article you read, I swear this is true, dilution will help with the process. You know, and it's like, don't worry, short-term impact, but dilution. It's as if our oceans are designed to clean up our messes for us. And that, again, it's part of read about there was the
State of the Ocean report.
It's just any example of a spill, they'll always talk about dilution as if the environment's there to pick it up. But the personal responsibility, it's always like, oh, don't worry, not too much harm is done. But it's cumulative impacts, too. All the spills that are happening all the time.
Well, there was just a big study done, the State of the Oceans report, that actually looked at sort of all the different impacts on our oceans, from acidification to climate change to overfishing, agriculture. I mean, our oceans are, like, in serious danger. I mean, we've got actually scientists writing reports using words like extinction. Like, scientists don't usually throw around words like extinction.
They throw words around more specifically like mass extinction, which is really a tragic one. And the interesting thing about it, and I'm referring to you guys as scientists, is that not a lot of people tie their own destinies to oceans. They're sort of ignorant of the fact that oceans are really responsible for producing oxygen that we breathe.
I was going to say, you take a breath and 70% of it comes from the oceans.
Yeah.
You know, that's how reliant we are on the health of the oceans. Every breath you take.
Well, and even if you were to avoid eating fish or eliminating shrimp part of your diet, it's a part of a larger ecological system.
Well, if our solution to our pollution problems is that we'll just all stop eating fish, is that it? Is that the solution? Honestly, you know, the way we're treating the planet. If our children from 20 generations later who could come back, you know, and they actually survive and everything works out, and they come back and they look at what we're doing right now, they'd be horrified. If somebody came from another planet and just was looking, oh, how are the humans doing on Earth, they would have to say, whoa, you know, whoa, my goodness gracious, these people don't get it. you know, these smart, large-brain primates are pretty clever. They can make all kinds of stuff, but they're eating their own assets. They're consuming the asset, which is our planet, which is our ecosystem. We live in this giant living system, and we were born into it, and we're halfway through the world's forests. There were once, you know, 6 billion hectares of forest. There's now half that, 3 roughly, and we high-graded everything. Mm-hmm. So my point is that, you know, as a civilization on a large scale, the scale of our entire operation is too big, and our sloppiness is unbelievably bad.
Well, I think at one level we're just fundamentally ecologically illiterate as a civilization. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably really the core of our problem is we just don't see these connections. We don't see that we're connected to the oceans and to the forests and to the biodiversity. We don't get that, you know, that this is an important part of life skills. You know, I think ecology is just as important, if not more important, than, you know, basic literacy skills when it comes to math or, you know, language. We need to be taking this seriously, you know, or we're just going to continue to make the same mistakes because fundamentally we just don't even get what we're doing to ourselves. And if we don't cure that, we're not going to address these larger issues, I don't believe.
I have here a lovely descriptions of the tankers. It says tankers would travel through gray whale migratory routes, through feeding grounds for humpback and orca whales, and past more than 600 salmon spawning rivers. A single oil spill could devastate the coastal communities and First Nations that rely on tourism and fishing, and currently 56,000 jobs are there earning their way through fishing and ecotourism. So we are definitely at a losing end of this battle if the Enbridge pipeline is to proceed and this coastal traffic.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that the government doesn't look at those numbers more carefully. Like, what are the other economic drivers? Again, it's like an addiction to resource money, and that's always where our money should come from, when actually there are growing industries, especially ecotourism and industry and you know, convention centers. That was a good example. I mean, how many people are going to want to come here to have a convention if, you know, the orcas have disappeared and our salmon runs? I mean, 2 years ago, the Fraser sockeye didn't come back. And now they're talking about this year, even though last year was spectacular. This year they're talking about another low year. I mean, what would happen if during one of those big years we had a tanker spill? I mean, we would talk about devastating our salmon. And, you know, when it comes to, it's not about numbers. It's when you talk to British Columbians and you mention orcas or you mention salmon, they get fierce. They get passionate. It doesn't matter where they live in this province. We value this. It's not even just about economic drivers anymore. It's about what we value as a people. Probably above all Canadians, British Columbians are connected to their environment, yet we are disconnected because we don't, you know, we get it aesthetically, but we don't get it ecologically. And I think what Ben said can't be underscored is that we need to start teaching ecological values to our children in our schools and through any means possible, because we need leaders who get ecological systems, because I can tell you a lot of them right now don't understand. It's really all about dollars. And we're not talking about, you know, changing our systems where we don't have a healthy economy. But again, this paradigm that we have to sacrifice the environment for a healthy economy is one that is so outdated, is so dangerous. And we need leadership that's going to actually start really seeing. I mean, we talk this way about the fact that they're connected, that a healthy economy is built on a healthy environment. But we don't have leadership that gets that yet. They're still using models from 50 years ago and 100 years ago, and that's got to change.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying there. I mean, basically we have to get beyond the point where it's the economy versus the environment, because the environment loses every time. We've seen it over and over and over again. And I mean, what is becoming abundantly clear is there's a ton of jobs in actually doing smart things. I mean, if we were retrofitting our homes to get to that sort of efficiency of energy use that Rex was talking about, I mean, that's the #1 employer of men in our province is construction. You know, and there's not a lot of construction jobs other than the big mega projects. We could be doing a mega project of retrofits and weatherization. There's like a million people. Heat pumps,
urban gardens.
Urban gardens.
You know, actually having resilient communities that take care of themselves is full employment. I mean, I've lived in small communities, on farms in small communities, and I can tell you, if you live in the bush and you keep yourself alive and grow food, you're fully employed. Everybody's fully employed. There's lots to do. You have to fix things. You have to grow your food. You know.
In the Lower Mainland, I mean, we're expecting something like 1 million people to move here in the next decade. Probably more than that because of what's going on around the world. but even just the baseline projections from our governments, about 1 million people. And the decisions we're making about highways versus transit is going to determine where those people live, what kind of lifestyle they have, whether it's car dependent or whether we're building these sort of densified hubs of development. So when you're looking at these options that we have right now, should we build South Fraser Perimeter Road out to Deltaport and pave over a bunch of our farmland, or should we be investing in public transit? I mean, it's got much broader implications than just buses versus cars. It's about what kind of communities do we want? Do we want livable communities? Do we want to be surrounded by toxins, or do we want to be living in places where you can actually walk to work, where you can know your neighbors, where you can have locally produced safe sources of food? I mean, these are really the things that are at stake when we're looking at some of these larger issues of transportation. And of course, it's got huge implications for our demand for oil as well. So all of these things are really connected.
Ask a country like Nigeria what it's like to be an oil state controlled by an oil industry. These people have been trampled over and their resources plundered. And we act as if we're willing to let Canada just be a resource colony for whoever, China, United States, whoever wants our oil or our resources and will pay us money. We'll close down our own refineries. We'll destroy our Canadian environment on the prairies and the boreal forests, and we'll risk our coast to be a resource colony.
And if not this place finding the alternative, this should be the place where the alternatives are coming from.
Yeah. Well, it's been a very interesting period that we're in, and we've been looking at things like moon landing recently, and what it took to land a person on a moon, and who did it, and how they did it. It is very interesting to have this perspective about Apollo and the program and NASA and the Russians as well. And you kind of have to really equate that to what is happening right now with what they're doing to assure us of a future that is sustainable and ecologically friendly, and that will curb the CO2 footprint. And that doesn't seem to really resonate with current government initiatives at all. There is no focus on the part of the government. There is no will to focus either. There is a lot of, though, investment in oil industry and assistance under a guise of alternative energy sources and green jobs and greener sources of power, right?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that ExxonMobil is the most profitable company in the history of industrial civilization. These big oil companies, here we're being told that we need austerity measures and we're all broke and the US is broke and Canada needs to look at austerity measures, and all over Europe we're talking about this. But meanwhile, these oil executives are making money hand over fist.
Well, not only oil executives. We are actually noticing that private industries are recuperating quite well from the economic crisis. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the rest of us are actually doing a little bit worse for wear. Mm-hmm. So there seems to be this disconnect between how things are versus what we're actually being told.
Well, there's a lot of money to be made in plundering the planet, and there's been a lot of money to be made in plundering the planet for hundreds of years. It's always been. The Persian Empire did the same thing. The Roman Empire did the same thing. The British Empire did the same thing. By plundering the planet, yes, you can live a pretty nice lifestyle. And if Vancouverites, for example, look at what we demand of the world for us to live the lifestyle that we live, I think we would all be trying to live more modestly. People can have compassion for people in the rest of the world. Africa's not poor because the Africans consume too much stuff. Mm-hmm. Africa's poor because the empires of the world plundered Africa for its resources, its human resources, its natural resources, and so forth, to create this lifestyle. So we have to understand that our consumption has a cost out in the world, and that if we want to be part of and I think most people feel this way. Most people want fairness in the world. Most people don't want to rip off the world, but there's a lot of money to be made by a very few companies at plundering the planet and creating some product and selling it to us. And so we have to understand that there are social values that are important to us that aren't going to be necessarily profitable. That we need a bigger picture of the world beside you can do anything you want as long as you make a profit and as long as you donate to a political party, you're going to be fine. Right? No, we need some other values in our culture other than somebody can get rich doing it, so it's okay. And those values, quite frankly, are we have to protect our local environment. That's what's going to help our children and our grandchildren endure over generations, is our local environment. We have to protect our communities. We have to keep and hold our families together. These are the things we need to do. We need to focus on our communities, protect our environment, hold our families together. We don't need more stuff to be happy. Right? We have 15% of the people in the world right now today consume about 85% of all the resources. So the rest of humanity is basically living on the leftovers. And there's 1 billion people starving to death. And we're in overshoot on our entire planet habitat, which is an ecological concept which happens all the time in nature. Animals grow to the size of their habitat, overshoot the habitat, and they either have to live in balance with their habitat or they crash. And we are in that state. As a species, globally, planet-wide, we're consuming more stuff than our dear Earth can replenish in a year. And Bill Reese out at UBC estimates we're at about 50% overshoot. Every year we consume about 50% more resources than our Earth can return to us. We're losing fisheries, we're losing forests every year. We lose about 13 million hectares of forests every year. Deserts are growing, fresh water is shrinking, numbers of fish are shrinking, sea is becoming acidic, we lop off mountaintops for coal, and we're heating up the planet like a flambe with hydrocarbons in the atmosphere. Insane. But civilizations go through this. But if we do not change, like massive paradigm shift in human civilization, the way we believe about going about things, we will have more serious problems. Civilizations have perished before. So the environmental movement isn't trying to be negative or be pessimistic. You know, in the fall time when the weather's getting cold and the leaves are falling off the trees, it's not pessimism to point out that winter's coming. It's not pessimism to point out that we're running out of resources. It's realism. And I want to be optimistic too, but I want that optimism to be based in realism.
From this perspective, it doesn't seem like the resources are running out. We live in a relatively stable environment that is very wealthy and rich in terms of resources, especially in British Columbia. It's kind of hard to say that our forests are disappearing because we have so much of it.
I think for most British Columbians, though, we have a real big disconnect between what we do in our day-to-day lives and the impact every one of those actions happens. I mean, it's what Rex said was exactly true. But it can also be incredibly overwhelming for anybody to go, you know, all this responsibility on me. And so unfortunately for a lot of people, they choose to do nothing. Or they, you know, and our leadership is kind of telling us, well, if you recycle, you're handling the environmental issues well. It's like we have to have a much deeper conversation as a society. It's like what we choose to buy, where we choose to live, all the choices we make in our day-to-day life, which a lot of people may think have nothing to do with the climate or the environment, but they do. Because when you buy a product at the store, how did it get to the store? It was probably brought by a truck using fossil fuels. How did it get to the truck? It was probably brought in by a ship. Ships use some of the dirtiest fuel out there. So when you buy the pink toilet brush at Walmart, you're actually having, there's a climate decision there. But I also think even taking a further step back, I think for a lot of us who work in this field, we talk about climate change and carbon, and we understand it. We've learned about it. But for a lot of people out there, we still need to have the conversation about how is this happening? Like, when fossil fuel is burned, how does that impact the climate? The reality is, recent polling done says a lot of people don't quite get all the connections, and it's not because they don't understand or aren't compassionate and don't care. It's just it can be a bit complicated, and you know, when you're getting your kids to school, trying to get to your job, you know, visiting the mother-in-law and all that kind of stuff, sitting down to understand the complexity of climate change, that's pretty heady stuff. So, but, you know, wouldn't it be great if our political leadership was providing that information? The community groups like ours are the ones who are trying to do it, and, you know, we don't quite have the budget of the government, but we're doing our part because we want to have these conversations with people because there is hope, and we are part of the solution, but we just have to talk a little bit more about what those solutions are and how we can do it together, not be so overwhelmed because, you know, I think for us, we have hope because it's probably the nature of our personalities and because we feel we have to, and we'd like to share that hope as well as the tools and the solutions with everybody and be part of that conversation because we have to have it because we're running out of time.
Well, I think it's important to recognize too when we're talking about people's understanding of climate change that Exxon, going back to these guys again, paid for 9 out of 10 of the reports that are trying to tell you that climate change isn't happening. In fact, there's a great book called Merchants of Doubt that looks at the connection between how the tobacco industry tried to convince you that secondhand smoke wasn't harmful and the very same techniques they're using now to try to convince us that climate change isn't a problem. Basically, there's this concerted effort by very sophisticated people in the public relations world who are trying to convince us not to worry. And it's basically a victory for them if they can make you believe that the truth is somewhere in the middle between what you're hearing from climate scientists and what you're hearing from guys like Exxon. So I think the question is, how do we break through that and get to the point where we're actually being given real options? And this is one of the other problems, I think, is we don't even really have the choices to make a lot of the time. Like for example, in BC we have a carbon tax, but if you live south of the Fraser, you've got very few transit options. So if you're being told, well, it's going to cost you more to drive, you got to get out of your car, what option do you really have? So to a certain extent, I think corporations are trying to make us believe that we have to make consumption choices, and that's going to be our participation. Vote with your dollars. And of course, we need to support the good local companies, and we need to not support the ones that are doing the wrong thing. But at the same time, we need to actually have governments that step in and actually give us options that actually fund the solutions. And there's a lot more jobs, quite frankly, in the solutions. It's worth pointing out. If you fund public transit, you get 3 times as many jobs per dollar as you do building highways. And you also protect farmland, and you also stop our exposure to toxins. It's worth noting that oil doesn't just create climate change. It's also toxic. Living in a city with automobiles is like the equivalent of smoking half a pack of cigarettes every day. And yet we don't even think about this in the context of the discussion of automobiles. I have a friend who says every car should have a warning label on it, just like a pack of cigarettes.
Well, I mean, people jog next to a road, and I always thought that's a pretty odd thing. You might as well have your mouth next to an exhaust pipe. Really, it's not very healthy at all. I know exercise is good, but there is exercise, and then there is exercise.
We also sit on outdoor patios and eat lunch while all the exhaust is coming in, right?
Yeah. Are there any sustainable alternatives to all of this that we've seen rise in our province, or for that matter in Canada?
Well, absolutely. I mean, BC is one of the leaders in green building worldwide. For a long time, we were seen as the most livable place on earth because we chose to not build highways in 1969 and 70, right? Like it changed the landscape of the Lower Mainland in a drastic way. We also get 90% of our energy from, so-called green sources, at least not carbon-intensive sources. But in the last decade or so, we've been moving aggressively in the wrong direction. We've been starting to build lots of highways. We've been, talking about doing stupider things with energy. We've been, become less energy efficient, not more.
This is very interesting because you are talking about the last decade, and that's a particular period where BC Liberals have entered the phase in British Columbia, and they had their shot at the rule, right? And they're still in power.
Well, and it's not just the Liberals. I mean, I think we have to look at Thatcher and Reagan and this sort of like liberal individualist sort of way of looking at the world, which is kind of moving away from seeing ourselves as connected to one another and connected to the planet, right? And I think there's many governments who've been responsible for this. There's definitely some blame to put on the shoulders of the Liberal government, but of course, that blame can be spread around.
I meant specifically in British Columbia, BC Liberal policies. What kind of policies are we actually seeing locally when it comes to sustainability?
Oh, I mean, we've got the lowest corporate taxes anywhere in Canada. We've got, any business that wants to come here and do business, their capital is welcome. And, and very little effort to actually genuinely have a dialogue with people about what they'd like to see in their communities. In fact, we've seen a reduction in public consultation.
Well, we've seen legislation that tells our communities that we have no voice. I mean, remember Bill 30, what was it about? It was about dispossessing the people of British Columbia of having a voice in the decisions that are going to take place in our own province. So we have a government who gave the public, or took from the public, their right to participate in these decisions. So they privatize and sell our rivers to General Electric and international corporations, and wait a minute, our public assets, our watersheds, our river valleys, to sell to General Electric, we get nothing, and then they take from us the right to have a say and voice this, because communities rose up and said, no, we don't want to privatize our watershed and turn our river into a General Electric power station. And our government came in and said communities cannot have an input into this process. So it's not just ignoring us, but passing legislation to kick us out of the political process.
And when it comes to environmental protection, I mean, the first 3-4 years of when the Campbell government came in was all about deregulation, making things business friendly, streamlining. They called it cutting red tape, but the devastation to our environmental protection laws in this province were just beyond words. I mean, we had report cards which were pages and pages of the deregulation, which were causing more pollution and more devastation because British Columbia was open for business, but for business that was doing harm to our environment.
Just to be fair, though, I think it's important to point out that the NDP doesn't get a free pass in all this as well.
Right.
I mean, you know, the Clayoquot Sound fights were happening with an NDP government, you know, and that was a big push in the environmental movement was actually a fight against the previous government. And I mean, the Liberals, for all the bad stuff they've done, and believe me, I've got a list that's quite long. You know, they also did bring in a carbon tax, and they brought in a commitment to reduce CO2, which was pretty aggressive and actually based on science. Now, of course, we've seen CO2 go up in the time since they've actually made those commitments, but it does give us some tools to work with, and the NDP fought against that very same carbon tax. So, I mean, really, I think what's important is that the general public really gets these issues and pushes anybody that's in power to do the right thing.
It's not a partisan issue.
That's right.
So, yeah, I think that's a really
it's an issue of industrialism. We've industrialized the planet. We were very good at it. We're very smart. My university studies was in physics and engineering. I worked as an engineer at Lockheed. I mean, I look back at the history of innovations in science. It's something we can be proud of. We're very smart and clever. We've done amazing things. Humanity has done amazing things. But industrializing our entire planet and trying to altern it into products that we can all buy and get richer and richer, you know, we now have 7 billion people. You know, we can't all have summer homes and summer cottages and go out to eat. You know, there's still 1 billion people, as I said, starving on the planet. Most of the people, 6 billion of the 7 billion, are hard-working, working class, unemployed, homeless, hungry, people barely hanging on, and people who are literally starving to death. So there's global equity issues, as Ben has pointed out, that the consumption decisions that we make and what we allow to happen in our province does impact people all over the world. Not to mention, by allowing Vancouver to be the tar sands shipping point, we're essentially saying we don't care about global warming, and the planet can heat up and whatever happens, happens, and we don't care. I don't think that's how the people of British Columbia, as Christianne was saying, that's not how the people of British Columbia feel. We don't feel that way. We do care about how the world is, and we want a voice. We want to be able to say that we believe that we can build a local economy that's thriving, where everybody's employed. There's lots to do, as we have said, and in terms of rebuilding our society to be genuinely sustainable, which means being modest, consuming less stuff, creating communities that are resilient and strong, local food sources, don't pave our farmland as highways, build public transportation. We can move lots of people around, low energy, low cost. I mean, I've lived in Europe. I know what it's like to live in a society where you can walk out your front door, get on a streetcar, and go to any other address in Europe. Nobody needs a car. It's ridiculous. I mean, we have our SkyTrain, but it sort of stops there, and then what? You know, where do you get on the streetcar? I mean, we just haven't designed our communities for us, for our people, for our citizens, and certainly for our children and our grandchildren.
Well, who are they designed for, in your opinion?
They're designed for profits.
Well,
the benefit of industry.
And if not in British Columbia, I mean, the birthplace of Greenpeace, of Adbusters, David Suzuki, I mean, this is like, you know, ground zero of activism in Canada, especially environmental activism. And as Christianne was saying, I mean, people care deeply about the environment here. You know, if we can't serve as a model for how to do things differently, and if we can't actually be that choke point between the tar sands and the expansion of the oil economy, I mean, I don't know who's going to. I think we have an extra responsibility in British Columbia to do the right thing.
And I think, you know, this idea that communities can't be involved in the conversation is also something that's very disturbing. I mean, the decisions being made around Kinder Morgan and the tankers and these are consultations that happen, but the documents and they're asking people to read our documents and give your comments. I mean, we at the Georgia Strait Alliance had to get a lawyer to look at it and make sense of it and to finally dig through and realize actually this was actually about increasing tanker traffic. Where's the open consultation conversations with people to say, you know, are you okay with this? Is this part of your vision of what you'd like in your community? It's not happening. And to me, it shows that the government and industry has a certain amount of disdain for communities. Like, we don't know, it's complicated, and that's the feeling I get. And I know the people who work in industry are not, you know, it's not like they're bad people, but the structure around it separates us. So industry makes decisions that impact us, but we have no say in it. And we are the ones that are going to pay the price when this bill happens. And, you know, industry isn't always on the ball. Like, to me, someone told me this recently around tankers. When the oil tankers go under Second Narrows, and so just so everyone understands, Second Narrows is the bottleneck point. Tankers can only go through there at high tide. It's a very short window. So what they do which is smart. They put out a call on VHF telling all the boaters and the ships in the area, a tanker's going through, you know, be careful. Well, the thing they haven't thought of, VHF is being replaced by cell phones. A lot of boaters, a lot of ships are starting to use cell phones, so they're not getting those announcements, which only increases the probability of something going wrong. To me, like, if you'd actually had some community people in the room, you might have been able to get that information from people. And there's probably another long list of other things that, for all their expertise, that they're not thinking about. And like I said before, the idea of their concept of risk is different than ours. And we need to be part of these conversations. And the fact that we as communities aren't allowed to be a part of it, or, you know, we have to have specialized people who can speak for us. I mean, our groups we represent our membership and our community, so I feel like I'm a voice for the people who support our organizations, but I think everybody needs to be part. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of passion in our communities, and we're not being allowed to be part of the decision making, which is very frustrating.
I mean, and frankly, they know very well that people are concerned about this stuff. I mean, I'm sure they've done their own polling, and I mean, there's a reason why this is all happening behind closed doors. It's because they're scared to face the public, because the public is going to say no. And quite frankly, it's completely unacceptable. And, you know, and we're just not going to let that continue to be the case. We're going to do everything that we can to make sure that, first of all, the public's aware what Kinder Morgan and other companies are proposing to do right in our backyard. And we're going to face them to actually, you know, we're going to force them to actually hear the voices of people of British Columbia. You know, if these companies think that they're going to be able to just push this stuff through in the cover of night with, you know, in some smoky back room somewhere, they've got another thing coming. That's not going to be what happens.
And let's don't forget that this is all happening on unceded Coast Salish First Nation territory, and this hasn't all been settled. And you know, there's the broadband here in that area around Kate's Park and Second Narrows. Yeah. That's their waters. It's been their waters for generations. And have they been consulted? Have they been asked? What do they get out of it? The potential they get out of it is that, you know, even more of their ocean resources that they lived off of for many generations before our ancestors came here is gone, and more could be gone. So they're potentially losing, you know, their livelihood, which is to fish from those waters. And I think that there's a big conversation that has to take place in British Columbia about bringing these oil tankers in here, and of course the companies don't want to talk about it with us because we have other opinions, and it's, you know, real democracy takes time, and you have to sit down with communities, and you have to come in and say, okay, here's a proposal, and this is why we want to do it, and this is what the community is going to get, and this is the impact, and here's the risks. And let's hear from the First Nations, let's hear from the Coast Salish Nations, let's hear from the people who live here, let's hear from other business operators, people who own restaurants and convention business. Let's hear from our local BC fishermen. You think they want oil tankers in British Columbia? I don't think so. So of course the companies don't want that conversation, because that conversation is going to necessarily go the way they want it. But I don't think the people of British Columbia want giant Suez-Max million-barrel crude oil tankers, up to one a day, and dredging the Second Narrows to get these Suez-Max tankers in here. I don't think this is going to fly with the people of British Columbia.
And that number is going to happen in about 5 years. We're not talking a 20-year span. The plan is, you know, within 5 years, we're going to be having one tanker a day, easy.
Great, we get to be the Suez Canal of the Pacific Northwest. You know, I don't want it. My children don't want it. My friends don't want it. Everybody I know, business people I know don't want it. First Nations people I talk to don't want it. I haven't really met anybody. We get a few tugboat jobs, sure, and you know, we have some of the best port tugboat captains and safety inspectors, and Vancouver can be very proud of its marine history.
Yeah, the coast pilots.
The coastal pilots, and they're all top-notch, first-rate, great. And there are a few jobs, sure, escorting these giant tankers out of the inlet with you know, our port facilities. But to risk a $40 billion oil spill that would destroy our local economy, it's just not worth it. And there's plenty of other work for all.
A lot of those very same mariners and you know, folks who really understand the risks better than most of us are actually the very same people who are the most concerned. They're the ones who are actually like ringing the alarm bell and calling up our office and saying, hey, we're worried about this, you should be paying attention.
A lot of communities that have tried to have a say in this, and the process is obviously broken. So what's the next step? Do we engage in acts of civil disobedience? Do we knock on the doors of our representatives? What is it that we can do in order to make an impact on this lacking conversation?
All of the above.
Yeah.
I mean, there's groups and individuals all across the spectrum, from folks who are interested in this sort of civil disobedience stuff to the people who are writing research and reports, who are doing public engagement. I mean, there's going to be public meetings that are going to be organized either by government or by us that are going to, let people know what's going on and invite people to the table. There's going to be I think we're just seeing the sort of tip of the iceberg as to sort of what's going to be happening in terms of the public engagement around this.
Well, to our audiences, what can they do?
Well, I mean, if they want to go to the Georgia Strait Alliance website, we have on our homepage, they can click and get a list of all the email addresses. I mean, I don't think the Minister of Transportation federally is hearing our voice, so we need to go directly to him. We need to get our Minister of the Environment to be fighting for our environment, because that's his job. If there's a risk here, he needs to be addressing that and speaking for us. But and I almost feel like we, the people, have to start educating our representatives. I mean, I know I've had conversations with local representatives, and they feel a little bit powerless because it's a federal thing. But if we can get our MLAs and our councils and our regional districts to be raising the issue and putting pressure, I mean, that's one of many tools, as Ben said, to do that. But that's something people can do right now. Send an email, phone, go visit. You have the right to go visit your MLA or your MP. Go spend 15 minutes talking about this, saying, this concerns me. That is the beginning of the conversation, and one of the many pressure points that we need to start doing. But that's one people can do right away.
I think people need to talk to their friends and neighbors.
Yes.
I mean, that's, I can talk to a lot of people, but it means a lot more if it's coming from somebody you know than if it's coming from, Ben the activist, right?
There's 1,000 opportunities to protect your own community, and they come up every day in every little way. Like, I think, what do people need to do? Embrace your community and realize that you are the future of your community. Talk to your neighbors. Find out, talk to people at work, not just about oil tankers, but how are our resources being used in the world, and how are we good global citizens in British Columbia? And I think most people want to be in British Columbia. And oil tankers is one of the biggest issues that we face. People can support the Wilderness Committee, support the Georgia Strait Alliance, support the No Tanks group. You can volunteer, you can donate money. These groups are all working hard. Greenpeace has been working hard. Support somebody and go to a meeting, get involved, talk to your schools. Teachers need to be talking about how we use our resources and so forth, and how people can work in the realm that they're comfortable in. And as Ben said, all of the above. If you know a politician, talk to that politician. If you work in the media, look into this, dig into this, find some real data, and tell the people the real story. Help the people, and don't just print the company press releases. If you work in the media, help your community. Look into this issue. Do your own research. Find out what's going on. However you're engaged in the community, please help us.
Yeah.
We need help.
Sat on a throne, cut from a chainsaw hand, rain racing like blood from the crater's plant. Some pillbox stores with lots of logos on the floor. Former, shore to shore. One red tassel, three-legged crow, stringing line down the mountain, left a two-side show. I don't strum for you, I won't make a move. See us stuck between the earth and yellow.